And welcome to the NeuroPod.
I feel the need for neuro-inclusion. I'm James Hollis, a proud autistic member of Britain's neurodivergent community and a massive Top Gun fan, as you may have clocked. Call me Maverik 4D, joined by my neurodivergent brother in arms.
I'm James Kenyon, fellow ADHD graduate from the northeast of England. Welcome to the NeuroPod, where we dive into all things neuro-inclusion, from autism to ADHD, dyslexia to mental health, with positive stories and practical tips for parents, allies, and anyone navigating a neurotypical world.
We're delighted today to launch our Neuro Odyssey from the fine Merseyside port of Liverpool, a bastion of northern tradition. Today's installment tackles autism and early years, my own journey through childhood quirks, a hot topic I'm sure for many families across the UK and beyond. My name is James Hollis, an open and active member of Britain's autistic community, and I am joined by James, who is going to take us through the next steps.
Expect honest chats with terrible Scouse accents, and whether you're neurodivergent or supporting someone who is, please subscribe on your favourite podcasting platforms such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify. That's the NeuroPod, all one word, or catch our exclusive video clips on YouTube.
And so with that in mind, I believe that James is going to be kicking off our very first interview today. Isn't that right, JK?
Thank you very much, James. We're wanting to go into this first episode and talk about your background and particularly your early years. And the first question that I'd like to put to you is, you've said to me previously that you were quite a slow learner as a young kid. Can you paint a picture of what that felt like? Maybe the age of around 4 or 5? Before you obviously had your autism diagnosis.
Of course, those first memories are quite hazy, James. I think one of the main things for me is I always remember that when it came to sort of reading and writing, I was quite a slow learner. I remember those who were watching over me in kindergarten were quite frustrated, I guess, to say the least, when it came to my learning how to read and learning how to write. Didn't quite understand why I wasn't keeping up to the speed of everybody else or the other kids. And I think as a result of that, there was a bit of a frustration on my part. One of the things I do on the point of frustration is that I remember saying to my dear mother, what was I like when it came to express those frustrations? And she was sort of like, well, you kept everything in. And when there was something which, so to speak, triggered you, then there was like a huge explosion of frustration.
So can you give me an example of the sort of things that did used to trigger you?
Well, I think it was coming back to sort of learning. If I wasn't sort of getting things right, it was on a number of occasions that there would be one incident maybe that didn't work out, the final straw that broke the camel's back. And that's when I sort of exploded into a real rage, I guess, as a toddler, and got very frustrated in that regard. And it wasn't a very pleasant experience to go through for everybody else concerned.
Can you give me an example that you can possibly remember or that your mum can remember of when that sort of thing happened?
So when casting my memory back, I think it was when I was trying to do some mathematics. Maybe that was more towards the school years. I remember my parents trying to support me with that. And I was just not getting it for some reason. It wasn't nothing. It was just not sticking, no matter which way they went about it. And eventually they had to give up because basically I then sort of collapsed again into a rage. Again, not a very pleasant experience for anybody. And certainly not for my parents, who of course were doing their level best to support me.
Yeah, I'm sure that must have been very difficult for everybody. I wanted to ask what it was like, how you found it generally trying to keep up with other kids in your very early years when you were at kindergarten, for example. Not just with schoolwork, but was there any social activities that highlighted anything that you counted?
So maybe going against the stereotype, I could say, a lot of people would assume that because of me being on the autistic spectrum that I found making friends or playing with friends during break time, that was actually a real challenge for me. It wasn't actually. I was actually quite outgoing in my own way. I was never really alone in those early years. I had quite a few friends. I was invited to parties, birthday parties, that is, and I invited them and everybody showed up, which was always a great sign, which of course made it much more difficult for my parents or indeed teachers in those early years to spot that maybe there was something about me which wasn't quite the norm, if I can put it that way.
Yes, when you were having friends to your parties and going to other friends' parties and that sort of thing, did you feel any of that frustration that you talked about a few minutes ago?
Not really. I think I was involved in games and even sport with everybody else as any, again, if I can use the term normal kid or child at that age would be. So it wasn't a case of there was a standout there and where everyone could say, James is different compared to everybody else. Though I do remember now that the memories are flooding back as we speak, I do remember a time when I was actually at my own birthday party quite early on, and I remember everyone was playing sports, and I felt it very difficult to get involved when I hadn't been asked to get involved. Now, that was quite interesting because if I just said, right, I want to get involved, then I was allowed to, I was included, and people allowed me to get involved. But I think when it came to being invited, that's something which wasn't forthcoming.
I just wanted to pick up on that because that's extremely interesting. You said, if I'm understanding you correctly, that you wanted to be invited or you waited to be invited before taking part. Is that about right?
Yes, that's right. Looking back on things, I think it was a case of you had, of course, the very popular kids, of which I was not one at the time, but I was trying to make sense of this idea as to why they were automatically invited by everybody else to get involved in something or to take part or participate in sport, for example, or in games, and I wasn't. So in that sense, I guess I felt left out because I wasn't actually being actively invited by anybody to get involved. The only way I could get involved was actually putting myself forward and volunteering. So in that sense, it was quite a bit of a challenge at the time because I guess everybody wants to feel like that they're wanted by everybody.
No, and of course, there's a natural instinct when you're a child to want to try and feel that you're part of the group, that you're fitting in. And did you feel consciously that you had to mask any behaviors or anything like that at that particular point? And maybe put it a slightly different way. Did you feel that you were having to hide parts of yourself in order to try and fit in at that point?
No, not in those early years. I didn't feel in those, when we're talking about early years here, we're talking about pre-primary school, maybe those first years in primary school when I was 4 or 5 years old. I didn't feel like there was any part of me which was particularly different compared to everybody else. I had hobbies, which in that regard were quite different and quite unique when compared to the hobbies of my school friends.
Yes, so one of the things that, so it sounds like I've done lots of research for the interview, but you very kindly provided me some autobiographical notes. So I'm very grateful for that. One of the things I understand was that you were quite sporty early on, especially with swimming, thanks to your parents encouraging you. And obviously the pool, you've been drawn to Liverpool in that watery spirit. So what was it about swimming that gave you enjoyment? Was it a sense, was it the water? Was it something else?
I think for me, it was the challenge, and I was quite competitive at that age. I guess quite a few young boys are, and I was always trying to be the best swimmer possible. And I actually have a sort of private tuition as well, where we were always trying to get your special badge, having done like swam 100 meters, and you get a badge for swimming 100 meters, and you get your badge for swimming 200 meters, etc. And of course, I was always looking to get the next badge, and there was a great sense of pride and achievement in that.
Yeah, I was going to say about the pride and achievement. Can you share a particular moment that really stood out to you as like a triumph or anything like that?
When it came to swimming in particular, I think you had the sort of 100, 200 meter swims that you had to complete. And then there was your challenge 1, 2, 3, and 4. It was such a long time ago. But I remember completing challenge 2, which was when you had to swim with clothes on. Because you had to swim, I believe it was 100 or 200 meters fully clothed, which of course weighed you down and which had required putting in extra effort in that regard. But that was a real sense of achievement when I managed to overcome that challenge, which I did. And then afterwards, I think that was it as far as challenges and ambitions were concerned.
So was it the competitive aspect of the swimming that you enjoyed most?
Well, it gave me a sense of pride and achievement, as I mentioned. It's not as tight a team sport as, for example, football is. Speaking to you now wearing my football team's shirt from the 1990s, Liverpool, of course. Football fan in that regard. Swimming also gave me a sense of being a great leveler in general. It gave me a sense of achievement. It gave me a sense of connecting with others because I was not the only one who was a swimmer, and there are many of my my school friends who were as well.
So in a sense, it made you feel like you were being included in something.
Yes, that's it. And so inclusion was right front and center of my mind even then, because as I mentioned to you earlier, James, it was a case that I wasn't automatically included. I had to actually volunteer to then be included, which at that age, kids are usually quite open and accepting when it comes to including others. If you ask them, can I be included? Or even indeed, can I be your friend?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about feeling included. I suppose in some ways, when you're a child, if you're good at something particularly, that makes you almost stand out and gives you it makes you stand out almost.
Yeah, stand out. And I think in those early years, kids are always looking for people to look up to in a way. And what more an achievement could it be that to see your school friends looking up to you because you've achieved something, which is great. So sport was one area which I really, really enjoyed as far as swimming was concerned. There was also track, which I also enjoyed when it came to athletics. But there were other hobbies as well, which were more solitary, shall we say.
Just wanted to ask you, before we move on from your swimming exploits, and I know this question is going to sound a little bit stereotypical, so please forgive me in advance, but I wanted to explore a little bit about the swimming itself in terms of, was there a sense of when you were surrounded by water, like the calmness of being in the water or the pressure or something like that? Did that in any way, in retrospect, can you tie that into any of your autistic experiences?
I think that, and maybe it'd be very interesting to hear what professionals, competitive swimmers have to say about this. But I think it really gives you a sense of freedom. And because I did also spend a bit of time with my own hobbies, was a middle way between being involved in sport in a team and being involved in a hobby which was very solitary. Because as I mentioned, yes, there is teamwork involved as far as swimming is concerned, especially when it comes to the competitive side. But I don't think as I mentioned, it's as tight as a sport like football, for example.
Now, what I want to do now is to delve into a little bit more about those other hobbies that you had. Now, in my extensive research for this first episode, I understand that there is something of an interest and a love for a certain railway conveyance that you engaged in. Could you expand a little bit on that, please?
One of the things I loved when I was primary school was I loved to get to know how things worked, in particular when it came to locomotion, and something we as those who are autistic or on the autistic spectrum, whether that be low functioning or high functioning, in my case, high functioning, we have what we call obsessions when it comes to interests, something that we're so unbelievably passionate about. And in my case, it was steam engines, how they worked, the steam they gave off, the locomotion, all of that fascinated me. In particular, because I became inspired by steam engines as a result of watching, of course, one of the most famous steam engines in the British Isles, which was, of course, Thomas, the tank engine.
I'm assuming that the area that you were growing up with, you were a fan of the original Thomas the Tank Engine, which was narrated, of course, by the great Liverpudlian Ringo Starr, and Thomas was Thomas used to do these very interesting things narrated by this rather laconic Scouse narrator, Ringo Starr. Was there a particular engine in Thomas the Tank Engine that you enjoyed looking at?
Loving the accent, James. It always gets me when you try and do that. But to your point, so first of all, one thing I would say is when I'm just talking about the obsessions, what I mean by obsession is that one thing my parents were fascinated about with me when it came to this absolute passion with Thomas the Tank Engine and steam engines was that I knew all of the trains, their names off by heart, but I also knew intimately their characters, which is also very interesting. One of the things I would say is that when it comes to characters and getting to know them intimately, I was the go-to, when it came to anything in that regard. And when it came to my favorite characters, I had two, actually, or should I say one and a group. So the first of my favorites was, of course, James, engine number 5, if my memory serves me well. And the reason for that is, spoiler alert, it's, of course, because my name is James as well. And also he was red, which is my favorite color, which is also reflected in the fact that I'm wearing a red t-shirt. Merseyside red, of course. But there was another group of characters in Thomas Tank Engine, which I was particularly keen on. And can you guess which group of characters that was.
Well, I'm not entirely sure because I do remember they had the coaches, Annie and Clarabelle, but I'm just trying to remember, was it by any chance the Troublesome Trucks?
Bingo. And the Troublesome Trucks, I think if anyone knows me, especially when I was at secondary school and then going on to university, I think a lot of my contemporaries out there from university and from school will probably be thinking now, light bulb moment, that explains a lot about that side of James's personality. Because when you think about it, when you think about the Troublesome Trucks, they are the personification of what it means to be troublesome. They've also got I would say, I mean, we were discussing this before we started recording, and they've also got quite a nasty side to them. But I always stayed on the troublesome side rather than going on to the unpleasant side. So for those out there, and for those who know me or knew me, I was annoying, and I did have that annoying side to me. And now I hope that provides some clarification as to why that part of my personality developed in the way it did.
What I'm fascinated by is the fact that you remembered the colours and the numbers and what have you, and obviously the names, but also the fact that you remember their characters as well.
Yeah, the characters were as important as remembering their names and remembering the numbers. It's quite an important point of curiosity as far as I'm concerned when you think about autistic spectrum disorder, because when we think of autism, we think of individuals, including kids, who are not particularly sort of attuned to getting to know the characters of others, because it's all about empathy at the end of the day. But in this regard, because it was such an interest of mine, steam engines and Thomas the Tank Engine and all the characters involved, I think for me, it actually enabled me, funnily enough, to understand the importance of getting to know a character behind a name, which was a great training in a way. Of course, if that had carried on, that curiosity in that regard, if that had continued to develop, my autistic journey would have developed in a very different way.
That's one of the interesting things that you're talking about, because there's a stereotype out there that people on the autistic spectrum are not sensitive and they're very hyper-focused. And I think what you've just said about the characters knocks that into a bit of a cocked hat in some ways.
Sure, and I would agree with that. It would have been really interesting to see, had that curiosity when it comes to characters of individuals continued, then I could have actually developed in a way which would have supported me as far as getting to know other people and sort of connecting with others. That would have become much more of a second nature. But I come back to it, the importance of the fact that we need to emphasize that this is the reason why I was so fascinated by character of particular individuals, was because it was based on a passion which I had, which was that for steam engines. A lot of the other areas that I was focusing on at school, because they were not passions, so to speak, because I wasn't going to primary school and learning about steam engines, for example, I wasn't developing that side of my personality.
I want to move on a little bit, because one of the other things that you've talked to me in the past about was another of your passions, which was sketching intricate military and soldier scenes. And I just wanted to ask, how old were you when that started, and what sparked that love of drawing those sort of scenes?
So I remember at the time, from a very early age, I mean, we're talking about 4 years old, I became very interested in history. One area of history which was always referred to back in the 1990s in particular was always about the two world wars of the 20th century. And having this curious personality that I had and still do have, I started looking into things myself. I had the history books on World War One and the Second World War. What I was reading, a lot of them were, especially at that age, picture books. And I think what I was drawn to was this idea or this notion of duty, which fascinated me, about sacrifice, about heroism. I was so inspired by this. I need to have it out, so to speak, in terms of putting my passion out there. And the way of doing it was by sketching scenes that I was already reading about in these annotated books.
Yeah, that paints a really vivid picture, actually. And I wonder whether you could walk us through a particular favourite drawing that you had, and what was that particular battle about, and what made that special to you?
Well, there were quite a few. I'm not sure if we've kept any of them, which is a shame. But I remember there was a scene from Pearl Harbor, actually, December the 7th, 1941, which of course was watershed moment because it brought the United States into the Second World War on the side of the Allies. I remember I was fascinated again by the locomotion side of things, i.e. the planes, because of course Pearl Harbor was very much about planes. Of course, it was ships that took the flak, literally, but that's the side of Second World War which I was very fascinated in and which I wanted to encapsulate in a drawing, which I did.
You've talked also about heroism and sacrifice, and that's something that really resonated with you.
It was, and that's why we'll probably go on to talk about this in a later episode, but that's why I was keen at one point on joining the armed forces, joining the British Army. And I think it left that impression on me that there was something quite amazing and quite inspirational about heroism, serving a cause which is greater than your own. Hearing about, of course, the stories from my friends and my grandparents who served in the war, and there was something very inspirational about all of that. I would say that it did actually land me into a bit of trouble from time to time with individuals.
Could you expand on that a little bit?
So when people saw me drawing these sketches on the Second World War, some people interpreted that as a glorification of war, which it wasn't. It wasn't at all. It wasn't at all about saying war is a great thing. People losing their lives is a great thing. But there was a lot of people who took that view. I was 4 or 5 years old, but I knew very much what war is about and that there was nothing glorious about people losing their lives. For me, it was all about the service, the dedication, and about sacrifice for a cause which was greater than yourself. So it was really nothing about wanting to see others suffer at all. I had problems in sort of articulating that to those who were older than me.
I just wanted to pick up on what you said there as well about how old you were. This is about when you were 4 or 5 years old. And can I just ask you whether you were able to articulate these things to other people and explain things, explain what you were doing and thinking at the time? Or was that something that you found difficult?
That was something I found difficult. That age, it was very difficult to articulate that. On one occasion, I remember there was one adult who, with my reaction to her questioning about why I was doing this, she got quite restless. And I think the reason for that is because I was making potentially the wrong facial expressions, which is, of course, a challenge when it comes to those who are on the autistic spectrum, because it's about how to express yourself in a particular situation as far as facial expressions are concerned, based on which would be appropriate based on the conversation you're having. So that was a real challenge.
So you're talking about your facial expressions conveying your inner thoughts, your emotions, that sort of thing. And I'm trying to think how to put this. The way that people do express themselves non-verbally is often quite key to our understanding. And so I imagine that there may have been a few occasions from what you're saying where you did feel misunderstood, even at quite a young age.
So when we're talking about there would be sort of explosions later on, it came to me building up emotions which I couldn't articulate properly. I think that was all part and parcel of this idea of me not being able to properly articulate what I felt to my parents. And all that happened was it was just storing things up. Then eventually it would just get too much. My level of tolerance would be overcome. That could have been avoided if I was able to articulate what I felt to my parents easier.
And of course, as you said earlier on, that's not just the preserve of people who are neurodivergent. What do you think sort of sparked those explosions? Was it a combination? Was it like sensory overload and frustration? Was it trying to make yourself understood? What do you think it was that triggered you in that way?
Well, one of the things that we must underline as far as autism is concerned is that we have, by and large, a very lower tolerance level when it comes to stress and anxiety. That doesn't mean that we can't deal with stress and anxiety, but we have to deal with it in a specific way, because we all go through stress and anxiety, but we need to just be able to manage it as best as possible. So coming to your question about what sort of triggered those, I mean, looking back, I can realize now there were a number of sensory overload issues, which of course we were not, when I say we, neither myself nor my parents were aware of, which of course would have led to that tolerance level being surpassed to the level where the emotions erupted. But I think it was also a case of things like, for example, when I wasn't able to, coming back to the learning, when I wasn't able to learn as easy as I perceived at the very least my peers were. So there was that, because the sensory issues were there in the background, of course that made it all the more difficult to be able to control those outbursts of rage.
Gosh, James, you've taken us on quite a journey just through your early years, from your frustrations with what you perceive to be your slow learning with your competitive swimming, your obsession with trains and sketching battles, and handling these big emotions. As I say, what is the one takeaway from your early years that you would want to convey to our listeners, particularly on neuro inclusion?
Well, I think for those first few years is that we all need to find our own way, okay? But I think one of the key takeaways that I would pinpoint would be this idea of us needing support in how to understand and manage those emotions, okay? It's not that, as I said, you're not going to get it right in those first early years when you're barely 5 years old, but it's a good way to start learning how to, start teach for parents to start teaching their kids or trying to teach their kids about how to recognize and deal with those emotions. Cooling off periods, very important. Okay. So those were some tips I would just give looking back on things. But if you can start at quite an early age to understand, to recognize those emotions and find ways to manage them as best as possible, I think that would be a great way forward in those first early years of life.
Well, that's absolutely spot on. So I wanted to say to our listeners, if this hits home, what James is saying resonates with you, please subscribe to the NeuroPod, all one word, on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also catch exclusive clips on YouTube, and you can follow our Neuro Odyssey from Liverpool to platform 9 3/4 and beyond. Please share our podcast to spread neurodivergent positivity.
And it's all like Maverik, everybody. And I'm looking forward to the next episodes. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.